Most things that people say to me just seem to slip my mind. Oh, but the suffering and painful times that were in years long gone are still as clear upon my memory as the numbers on my arm. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Who will stand before the world knowing what to say when the very last survivor fades away? When I hold my grandson close to me and his fingers trace the pattern of my tears, he asks me, "Grandpa, tell me, why do you cry? What is it that you fear?" And I tell him there once was another child who smelled this sweet and felt this warm, but he was taken from before my eyes, and only I remain to mourn. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? And who will stand before a world that now wishes to deny? Or will they believe in someone who never heard the cries? There is nothing I can say or do to make things change. Time has a way of passing by so fast, and like a fleeting shadow, no one will recall the faces of the past. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Yet one thought gives me comfort, it's all that I have left. Oh, I know that God in heaven won't forget.
Good morning and welcome to our annual Yom HaShoah Memorial Observance. My name is Shirley Silberstein. This community service is co-hosted by Temple Torah, Congregation Lador Vador, Marathon Jewish Center, and this year we welcome Hollis Hills Bayside Jewish Center to our community. This year's theme is Remembering the Past to Preserve our Future. The speakers are Mr. David Lockman, Dr. Herbert Lockman, and Mr. Charles Lockman, who will tell the story of their father, Irving Lockman. And Irving Lockman heroically survived the atrocities of Nazi Germany, only to tragically fall ill to COVID. This service is dedicated to all those who succumbed to COVID during this past year of the pandemic. Before we continue, for the best Zoom experience, we recommend that you select speaker view, not gallery view. Thank you for joining us today. If you are comfortable doing so, please stand for the national anthem sung by Dr. Ken Kahaner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight all the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bomb bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
The people that have passed, and as Jewish people, we have to think about what is our role in this world. What does it mean to be chosen? To stand up against prejudice, anti-Semitism, but all prejudice around the world. Being chosen means there's a responsibility to every single one of us. The Nazis didn't look for Hasidic. They weren't looking for Orthodox, Reform, conservative Jews, unaffiliated Jews. If you were Jewish, they murdered you. We have to be a role model for the world of what it means to be chosen, what it means to be a leader, what it means to stand up. That's one message I take from this story, that we have to be the leaders when it comes to prejudice, when it comes to BDS, of our grandchildren, what they face in college on a daily basis. We face in the streets in Williamsburg, being punched in the face with a hat, throwing off a Hasidic hat. And we did stand up. Jews from all backgrounds, affiliations came and they marched. Was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when Jews were being targeted? And we have to do the same for the other communities as well. That's what it means to be chosen. Another important lesson I take from this powerful story is that as we remember the 6 million that have lost their lives, we think about the survivors. We celebrate the survivors, that they picked themselves up from the ashes and started their life again. There's a story of an older man that would stand in Borough Park every day at a certain time. And someone would ask him, why are you standing here every day? I see you every day here. What is it that you're looking at? It wasn't a park, It's 13th Avenue. It was a busy street, a lot of double parked cars, a lot of buses and people honking the horn. Why do you stand here? So I come here to look at the boys and the girls going on the bus to the yeshiva, to the schools. This is my biggest revenge to Hitler. He was a survivor, of course. And I think you take from the story of Rabbi Halberstam the same thing. The biggest answer that we could do, the biggest way we could have revenge is, one, to be a role model, to be chosen to lead, to show the world what it means to lead. And the second is to be proud of our Judaism, to be more connected in our synagogues, to be more involved, to really, that's the answer. That is one of the biggest ways to have revenge is Am Yisrael Chai. is to Jewish people continue to live a Jewish life, to be proud of their Judaism, proud of Israel, proud of what it stands for, proud of our heritage, not to be bashful. And Rabbi Halberstam did the same. And many survivors, and including Mr. Irving Latchman, who got up and built a family. So I want to thank you again for being here. Thank you again for the committee. And I'd like to introduce Rabbi David Weiss from Hollis Hills Bayside Jewish Center to lead us with the Mishaberach. Mishaberach is for those who are not well, especially those that are impacted by COVID. And unfortunately, we lost 900 survivors this past year in Israel to COVID. So let us pray for the complete healing for all those that are impacted by this virus and from all illness. Rabbi Weiss.
Shalom. In these difficult times, we pray for healing. And so I share this prayer by Rabbi Simcha Weintraub with those who have been stricken with COVID in mind. Eloah kol habriot, God, creator of all living beings. The family of humankind is facing a devastating pandemic spread across the earth and causing incalculable suffering and death. So many of us have been diagnosed with this perilous virus, plunging us into further uncertainty, distress, and terror. We turn to you for special support and strength in this time of great vulnerability and despair. Bring all who have been stricken a refuah shlema umehera, a speedy, sturdy healing in all dimensions possible. Strengthen and guide those healthcare professionals who are laboring to restore health, as well as all the ordinary people who make day-to-day life possible. Enable communities and society to care for those who are ill, as well as for those who love them, who cannot be physically in touch with their close ones. As we pray for all who are stricken with COVID, so we pray for all those experiencing sudden and severe illness. May we soon see a world vaccinated and restored to life, returning to a sense of normalcy and appropriate routine, while actively committing to undo the extreme inequities that this pandemic made plain for all to see. For you, compassionate one, are the healer of all, doing wondrous things. So many people have been stricken with COVID, but we must not forget those who battle the more familiar illnesses: cancer, AIDS, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's and dementia, mental health illnesses, and others. And so all those in need of healing can be prayed for with the Mishaberach. As I chant the traditional formula, I'll pause, and you can include the names you have in mind for healing while I pause. Mishaberach Avoteinu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah, U'ivarech v'Yirapeh kol hacholim. Ba'avor shekulanu mitpalalim ba'adam, b'schar zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu yimal rachamim aleihem, v'hachzikam l'rapotam, v'yishlach la'em emeira refuah shlema min hashamayim, l'chol evreihem l'chol gideihem, refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, b'toch sha'ar cholei Yisrael v'chol yoshvei tevel, v'chazek et yedei haoskim b'tzorcheihem, hashta b'galav izman kariv, V'nomar, Amen. Refuah shlema, a speedy recovery to everyone.
In Israel, on Yom HaShoah, everything stops, no matter where you are. A siren goes off, and whether you're driving on the road, in your home, at work, everything stops and everyone stops. We're now going to experience this by watching this video. If you're comfortable, please stand and remain standing for the Hatikva. Thank you. Now Irina will lead us.
נפש ייחודי עונייה ולפתי מזרח קדימה עין לציון צדיה עד לעבודה תקוותנו תקוות שנות אלפיים לחיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון וירושלים לחיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון וירושלים.
Thank you, Irina. You may be seated. It was 1942, and Azriel David Fashtag was on a train heading to the death camp of Treblinka. He was known as a chazan with a beautiful voice. Amidst the suffering on the train, he composed a melody to the words of Ani Ma'amin. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Mashiach, and even though he may delay, I wait each day for him. Azriel David began singing the song, at first quietly, and eventually with his full voice. Soon, everyone in the train was singing together with him. Please join as Sally Coons leads us in this powerful song of faith. Ani Ma'amin.
Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Be'emunah shleima, B'viat HaMashiach, B'viat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, Ve'achapi she'itmanea, Im kol zeh ani ma'amin. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emunah shleima, b'viat HaMashiach, b'viat HaMashiach, ani ma'amin, ve'achapi she'itmanea, Im kol zeh ani ma'amin. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emunah shleima, b'viat HaMashiach, b'viat HaMashiach, ani ma'amin, ve'achapi she'itmanea, Im kol zeh ani ma'amin.
Talmud says that whoever destroys a soul, it is considered as if he destroyed an entire world. and whoever saves a soul, it is considered as if he saved an entire world. We light 6 candles today in memory of the 6 million souls that were destroyed. We light these candles to remind us of what could have been but will not be. We light these candles so that their souls will guide us to help repair the world. For the first candle, we call on Maya Nowakowski.
My name is Maya Nowakovsky, Maya Bat Shmuel. My father, Samuel Kerner, was born in Lvov, and my mother, Mariam Perelman Kerner, was born in Zhytomyr. They grew up in poor, modest families, but got good education and became successful professionals. They met in 1939 in August, while they were on vacation with their respective friends. World War II broke out just a week after they met. And within several weeks after that, their homeland, Poland, ceased to exist, being divided between Stalin and Hitler. In their judgment, they had a better chance to survive as Jews in the Soviet Union. So they went to Lvov, which was under Soviet control, and married there in 1940. Less than a year later, in 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union and they had to run again. This time joining thousands of refugees and evacuees and reaching Kazakhstan, where they remained until the end of the war. They avoided this way getting into concentration camps or being killed outright, but were not spared from hunger or disease. After the war ended, they were hesitant about going back to Poland. And in the end, they returned to Warsaw in 1952. By that time, I was 4 years old and a living proof of their will to survive as Jews and continuing to have a life, starting over.
That's right. That's one much.
My parents were astute enough and lucky enough to escape Hitler. I think my mother's greatest regret was that she didn't have a chance to help or save a large number of her family, including her own parents, and could not even say proper goodbyes to them. And they all perished, most likely in 1943, where the ghetto in their hometown was liquidated by Hitler. I'm deeply grateful to Congregation Lador Vador and for this opportunity to honor their memory and the memory of all those who perished in the Holocaust. I would like to just add a few words about my mother-in-law. She was born in the town of Rovno and was only 16 years old when the Germans took over Rovno. And she had no chance of running away. And in early 1941, the Germans marched practically all the Jewish population of that town to a forest outside of town, a few miles, and killed them all there, close to 20,000 people. On the way to the site of this action, my mother-in-law ran away from the ranks, from the march, and hid in a ravine until all the shootings stopped. She sought shelter and got help for a few weeks from a friend. And then my father-in-law, who was a Polish Catholic and a good friend of hers, offered to marry her as a way to get false identity and legal papers under the German occupation. This scheme worked, and they moved to a different town to avoid being recognized. And my husband was born about a year later in 1942. This story is actually described in a book by a historian. It was published about 10 years ago. Now I would like to light a candle to honor the memory of my parents, my mother-in-law, and all those who perished in the Holocaust. Thank you.
For the second candle, we'd like to ask Eileen Baker to tell us about her experiences.
My name is Eileen Perman Baker. I was born in Hufgeisbach, Germany in 1947 in a United Nations refugee hospital in a displaced persons camp. My parents, Malka and Fischl Perman, were married in 1938 and were living in Warsaw, Poland when World War II broke out. My father was in the Polish army, and when Polish troops were caught between the German and Red armies, the units disbanded. Many of the men decided to go east into the Soviet zone with hundreds of thousands of others who were now wandering the countryside. This was a good choice, since most of the Jews that survived the Holocaust were those who went east. My mother was living in Warsaw with her in-laws and a new baby. My father sent someone to get his wife and son. They made their way further east by foot, along with others, only to be interned in labor camps in Siberia, a cold, vast land. My father worked in a uranium mine, and my mother fed soldiers in a prison. My parents told stories of walking in newspapers in the ice and snow because they had no shoes. They survived typhus, lice, hunger, freezing temperatures, and pneumonia, but lost a child in Siberia who had to be buried in the frozen tundra. In 1943, Stalin released some of the Polish citizens who had been in the labor camps, and my parents followed thousands of others by foot to Uzbekistan, where they remained until the end of the war. When the war ended, my parents were able to leave the Soviet Union and were hopeful that some of their family members had survived. So they walked, took trains, and whatever mode of transportation was available, looking for surviving relatives. They got to Poland, where the International Red Cross helped them in their search, but they found no one. There were names of people who were dead and lists of people who had survived. People would ask if anyone had seen a brother, sister, mother, etc., by placing messages on trees. My parents continued traveling to Germany, where they had been told there were refugee camps being set up by the Allies. In November 1946, they arrived at a displaced persons camp in the American zone. I have pictures of my parents taken when they arrived. They are disheveled, gaunt, dirty, dressed in rags. My father weighed 90 pounds and my mother 92 pounds. It was in the displaced persons camp that I was born. It took several years before we were able to emigrate to America. My father had a sister who had moved to America before the war, and she was able to sponsor us. We arrived in New York on May 4th, 1950. I light this candle in memory of my parents who survived the Holocaust and emerged with determination and the ability to embrace life and to build a new family.
For the next candle, we call on Rosette Teitel.
Hello, my name is Rosette Teitel. I'm a member of Hollis Hills Bayside Jewish Center and of Marathon Jewish Center. I was on a farm during the war, sort of hidden, but the family didn't know they were hiding me because they were getting paid for it. That was a terribly lonely and isolated time. But now I have the support of two wonderful congregations and two wonderful rabbis at the head of these congregations, for which I'm really grateful. I will now light the candle.
For the next candle, we call on Rita Katz.
Hello, my name is Rita Katz. Miracle of my father, Larry Hershkowitz, who survived 5 years of living through the atrocities of the Lodz Ghetto and Auschwitz concentration camp. Unfortunately, my dad passed away in February at the age of 97, so that I am now the keeper of his stories that I will continue to pass on to my son, grandson, and generations to come. As a young teenager, my dad hid from the Nazis in the Polish ghetto of Lodz from 1940 to 1943. He hid in attics, under garbage, and did whatever he could to earn money and valuables that he would barter. He would sew clothes, he would scrounge for food, he would do anything else he could to help his family try to stay alive and survive in the ghetto. He was only 16 years old when his city was walled in and it became a ghetto. Unfortunately, while trying to survive life living in the ghetto, his older brother, younger sister, and his father all succumbed to hunger and disease and died, and my father had to bury them all using his own bare hands. When his mother became gravely ill, she begged my dad to have both him and his middle sister approach the authorities within the ghetto in hopes that she would get medical treatment, and he did so, thinking he was going to save her life. But he and my aunt never saw their mother again. Instead, my father and his sister were transported using the trains that we've seen in the movies, and they were separated within the nightmare of the concentration camps. He became number B-7609, which was tattooed on his arm in Auschwitz, where he worked and endured horrible tortures, vowing to survive and reunite with his sister after the war. The Americans liberated him in 1945 when he was 21 years old, and he was one of the living skeletons we've seen in the old TV reels and movies. The 5 years of being in the ghetto and concentration camp were filled with pain, starvation, suffering, and countless stories that would be burned into his memories and stay with him the rest of his life. He did manage to find my aunt while living in a displaced persons camp, and they were able to eventually come to America, sponsored by an uncle who lived in Brooklyn. They came with no money, little more than the clothes on their back, learned English and the American way, and with determination, shrewdness, his survivor mentality, the skill of being a tailor, he built a business, met and married my mom, and had a family and a good life here. My father and many of his friends were invited by the Shoah Foundation to view the movie Schindler's List, and his lone takeaway from watching it was that if the deplorable conditions depicted in the movie were equal to what he personally and truly encountered, his life for those 5 years really wouldn't have been so bad. As an example, he told me that in Auschwitz they had to sleep sideways in a bunk 4 abreast, and the only time he would get a good night's sleep is when one person had died at night and didn't move until he was removed the next morning. Just one example of all the stories I have lived and heard since I am 5 years old. It has been written and said that survivors of the Holocaust fall into 2 basic categories. Those who can never say a word of anything that happened to them, which was an example of my aunt, and those like my father who could never stop talking about everything that happened to them. He felt that no one should ever forget about the Holocaust, and he was hoping more than anything that as a society, we would never let it happen again. That commitment of having no one ever forget is what drove him to record his personal memories with the Shoah Foundation and the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. If you ever do visit the museum, you can listen to him and watch him tell his story. Just ask for Larry Hershkowitz. Thank you for listening, and I will now light this candle in his memory and to remember all those who perished in the Holocaust. In memory of all those who died. Thank you.
For the fifth candle, we call on Jeff Bialowitz.
Brothers, the moment of destiny has come. Most of the Nazis have already been killed. Let us rise and destroy this place. We have little who will die fighting with honor. However, if by chance someone should live and escape, bear witness and tell the world what happened here. These are the words that were heard by the nearly 600 prisoners, including my father, Philip Bialowitz, just prior to the revolt at Sobibor. Our dear father, dad to Simone, Jeff, Joe, Michael, and Evelyn, was born in a small town in Izvica, Poland. But by the time he was a teenager, his childhood would be lost forever. His mother had been shot by a German firing squad, and my father would escape death several times in his town's ghetto, including being fired upon by a German firing squad, then to lose most of his family at Sobibor. My father remembered that the moment he arrived at Sobibor, part of him thought, after going through all of his terrible experiences in the ghetto, at least if they killed him, it would be his end, and he could have some peace. But at the same time, he was only a teenager and he wanted to live. My father played an instrumental role in the escape plan. With stolen weapons in hand, approximately 600 prisoners rushed toward the barbed wire fences and then towards the forest. My father, surrounded by exploding mines, correctly guessed that it would be safer to run alongside the German barracks, as they would not cause damage to their property. Along with about 200 other prisoners, my father made it to the deep forest and then met up with his brother Simcha, a pharmacist, who saved my father's life by telling the Nazis and convincing them that he was his assistant, thus giving my father a chance at life. The revolt at Sobibor was the largest and most successful prisoner uprising in World War II, second in scope to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. At Sobibor, the Nazis suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the virtually unarmed Jewish prisoners. Philip Bialowitz completed his mission here in this world as he bared witness and told the world about his experiences. This is a great honor to be standing here again before all of you on behalf of my father, Philip, and the Bialowitz family. Thank you.
For the final candle, for the sixth candle, we call on Herb Cooper.
We're here today when we light our candle, to honor my uncle, Harry Weitzman. In May of 1938, Adolf Hitler marched into Austria, and almost immediately, people marched in the streets, yelled things against Jews, broke windows in stores that were Jewish owned. Almost 3 weeks after Hitler marched in, I and other Jews in the gymnasium school were thrown out of school. My uncle was a hero in the previous World War, and he wore a medal. He got a medal, and various other Jews who similarly were honored, when they were in the streets, were afraid to go, but when they wore the medal, they left them alone. He was considered a good Jew. A few weeks afterwards, medal or no medal, didn't make any difference. He was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp. Now, near Dachau, the Germans built a factory to manufacture munitions. And my uncle at that time was in reasonably good health. So he was transferred to the factory working on munitions. He worked there almost a whole year. He got sicker. Food, of course, was not good. The treatment was not good. So he got sick and he was no longer considered to be a good worker. So he was transferred back to the concentration camp. 1 month later, he and others were sent to and murdered in a gas chamber in Dachau. And here is the candle that I have here that to honor my uncle.
We now call on Cantor Zim for El Mole Rachamim in memory of all those that perished in the war, in the Holocaust.
El Mole Rachamim, Shochene Bamromim, Hamitzay Menocho Nechono, Talchat Ganefei, Hashechino. B'ma'alot kedoshim utehorim, Kizohar Rokia, Mazehirim, Mazehirim. Et nishamat, et nishamat, Acher b'nei Yisrael, Am b'kedoshim v'yatehorim, Shenoflu b'idei harotzim, v'nishepechu damam. Hem sheneharigu v'shen yisrafu v'shen yishchetu b'mot HaShoah v'yagevora. Elu b'Yoshevitz v'yail b'Trebelinka v'yail b'Dachau v'yail b'chol machanot hamovet v'chol eile שמוסרו נפשום על קידוש השם. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם בעבור שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם אחים ואחותיהם נודרים צדקה בעד נשמותיהם. בצרור בצרור החיים, בצרור בצרור החיים, ויצרור בצרור החיים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם. ונאמר
Thank you, Cantor Zim. We would now like to call on Rabbi Green to recite for us the Kaddish. For all those who are able to, please rise at this point. Thank you.
We recite the mourner's Kaddish not only for all those who were murdered by the Nazis, Yichmach Shamam, but also for all the survivors who no longer walk amongst us. Yikadal v'yikadash Shemei Rabbah, Bi'alma divra chirute yamlich malchute, B'chayechon uvyamechon uv'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala uzman kariv yimru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam amei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbawar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei dekudesha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechamata da'amiram b'yalma v'yimru Amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabbah min Shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom v'ramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated.
I have the honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Herb Lackman to speak about the life story of his dear father, Irving Lackman, who was a member of Temple Torah for all the years that he lived in Little Neck. Irving was the sweetest guy, came to services every Friday night, crossed the dangerous road, Little Neck Parkway, in the middle of the road. Came to Sunday services, was always involved. When I asked him to speak about the Holocaust years ago for this program, he refused. He said, every time I speak, I won't get through the first 2 paragraphs. So he did tell the story to his children, and we're honored here to have with us Dr. Herb Lackman. And sadly, Irving, as I mentioned before, passed from COVID April 21st of last year. And I guess this is also a memory of all those that passed from COVID as well. Without further ado, Dr. Herb Blackman, please.
I'm Herb Blackman. I'm the middle son of Irving Blackman, who is being honored today. My father was born on March 6, 1921, in a small town in Poland called Grodzisk, which is 40 kilometers from Warsaw, and only about 20 kilometers or so from my mother's hometown, which was Żarów. And Grodzisk had a pretty thriving Jewish community at the time. Jews were coming into that city since the 1700s, and by the time my father was born, about 1/4, 1/3 of the population were Jews at the time. My father was the middle son, like me, of 3 brothers and 3 sisters, who he cherished. My father's childhood was pretty standard. There was a poor Jewish family, but they ate well. They didn't have any major concerns. There were no major pogroms in Poland, in their town at the time. My father may have been harassed on occasion, taking train to and from Warsaw, but he never had to raise his arms in self-defense. So it was not that terrible. He enjoyed playing soccer. He loved to follow boxing. He was a fan of Max Baer, who was an American Jew who was the world heavyweight champion in the 1930s. So he followed that. And he worked very hard. My father's father was a locksmith. All the Jews in that town were tradesmen, butchers, cabinet makers, shoemakers, and so on. It was not an assimilated community. You didn't find any university students there, the way you would find Jews living in Hungary or Germany at the time. But it was a very simple life. My father was very good with his hands. He worked his father's locksmith business, which was in the house, and he fixed bikes on the side, which I appreciate as a cyclist. And he wanted to be a carpenter. So he went to trade school in Warsaw. He commuted 6 days a week to go to work in Warsaw and go to school 3 of those days. And his days were very long, from 5 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. So life was going well, and the whole world kind of erupted, literally, on September 1st, 1939. When the Germans invaded Poland. They bombed Warsaw to smithereens, and then they turned their attention on the neighboring towns, including my father's, and they were bombarded. My father recalls at 3 o'clock that afternoon on September 1st, his town was bombed. The family was frightened. They felt for some reason that they might be safer in a big city, so they all went to Warsaw to live with my father's aunt. She had a 1-bedroom, 1-kitchen room in a basement in Warsaw, and 12 people lived there for several months. There was no sanitary facilities. They had to get water from the courtyard. Food was very scarce. They stood in line for bread for hours, sometimes coming back empty. And life was obviously not good. They decided to go back to Grodzisk, which they had to do by foot because the railroad trains were bombed and they weren't working. And then when they got to Grodzisk, they realized that the Germans had occupied the town. And they did what they do in all of these Jewish towns. They marked the Jewish shops, they marked the Jewish apartments, and they made the Jews wear Star of David bands on their arms. And eventually, all the Jews from town were forced to go back to Warsaw to go into the Warsaw ghetto. My father's aunt's apartment was in the ghetto, so they actually went to her apartment. And my father stayed back to do work, and the conditions were quite brutal, as the Germans would brutalize Jews just arbitrarily. My father had to shovel snow on one occasion, and when they ran out of shovels, he was forced to shovel with his hands. So he eventually was forced to go back to the Warsaw Ghetto himself, and he lived there for a time. But one of his friends escaped the ghetto and was able to go to a town called Izbich, which was nearby. But he was told, he got word back to my father that there were no Germans, the Jews were free, and there was food. So my father decided to leave his family and go to this town. And to do that, he had to sell his boots to get money to make false documents to get him out of the ghetto. And he went to this town, and he spent 3 months there. He found work on a Polish farm. The farmer had no interest in having anybody there, but my father said, "Give me one day and show you what I'll show you my stuff," so to speak. And my father worked very hard, and the farmer was very pleased, and he kept him on for 3 months. And then the Germans issued an edict saying that any farmer harboring Jews would be killed. So my father had to leave. So my father went back to Izbich, and he was arrested and sent to a work camp called Zanach. He worked very hard there. For example, he and other Jews had to carry telephone poles to raise and to plant, so to speak. Food was very scarce, and if you didn't work hard enough, the Germans would shoot you. So even though they were weakened by lack of food, they had to persevere and do this very, very hard labor. And lots of Jews obviously were killed or died from disease and hunger during that time. My father had a ration of watery soup every day, a liter of soup, a couple hundred grams of bread, moldy bread. The conditions were very, very terrible. Eventually, he was taken in by one of these SS guards who liked him because my father was very good with his hands. And my father fixed a chair for him. He fixed the guy's roof. And even though this was a very brutal SS officer, he took a liking to my father miraculously. My father got sick with typhus. My father was very sick, and the commandant told him to get dressed and go to work because everybody was going to, people in his barracks when he were going to die. So my father's life was saved because this commandant took a liking to him for his skills with his hands. Eventually, that camp was closed, and my father was sent to Majdanek, a true extermination camp. It had 7 gas chambers, had 2 gallows. Majdanek was one of those camps where the execution of Jews and other prisoners was executed on an industrial level. So life there was really quite harrowing. My father called having roll calls, having to stand for hours for no reason at all, sometimes in the snow, sometimes with very, very spare clothing. He was subjected to arbitrary whipping. He had to do hard labor. He dug trenches. He had to dig graves. He had to haul dead bodies to these graves. He laid pipes in the fields, carrying the water and sewage. And on one occasion, he found some wheat kernels in the field that he hid in his pocket. He was spied by an SS guard doing that, and he was beaten for that in a very humiliating manner. They put his head in a wagon wheels. They made him pull down his trousers, and he was whipped on his behind for that infraction. And he stayed there until June of 43. That was just before, he left just before a mass execution occurred, or a series of mass executions occurred at this concentration camp. And on November 3rd, 1943, 18,000 Jews were killed in one day. I mean, it was just horrifying. But my father was able to leave. He was forced to go by cattle car to Birkenau, which is a satellite of the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp. So at Birkenau, he was tattooed with his number, the one he showed proudly, his survival number, 129423. And he was given, he was issued prison clothing, and the underwear that the prisoners got were cut out of prayer shawls. The shoes that they got were shoes from the dead. And Jews were coming into this camp from all over Poland, and the conditions got too crowded. So the way the Germans handled that was to select Jews for execution based on whether they were sick or not. They were selected, the infamous selection process. And the doctor who selected the Jews was the infamous Joseph Mengele, and that name looms large in our family. My father recalls standing only a few feet from Mengele, and my father his barracks was chosen for selection one day, and Mengele would inspect the inmates, the prisoners, the Jews, and decide who would go on the left line, which is destined for the gas chamber, and who would go on the right line, on the line to the right, to live another day. My father was sick at the time. He was selected to die, and he noticed that one of his friends, who was robust, relatively speaking, was sent to the right side, and he realized that he had to be him. So in this moment of inspiration, he yelled out that he's a carpenter. And one of the German higher ups said, "You need carpenters," and he was taken from the left side to the right side. So he survived with this moment of inspiration. Eventually, my father was transferred to another work camp, Jabozna, where he worked in a coal mine. He worked from 10 o'clock in the morning to 11 at night. And he actually didn't mind that work, because at least for that half a day, he was out of sight by and large from the Germans, who didn't like to go that deep into the earth. So he actually didn't mind doing that at all. But he was also beaten on occasion. There was one time when he was on some kind of detail in the kitchen. He found some scraps of beets that he wanted to eat. He was late for roll call because of that, and he was whipped for being late. The mine closed in January of 1945, and he was forced to walk for 4 days to a town called Bethlehem. This was in the winter. It was freezing. Their clothes were sparse. The shoes were worn. And the way they handled this was, and they had to walk at night. So they walked in threes. So there were two men on the outside and one guy in the middle, and the person in the middle would rest and kind of sleep while he was dragged along by his two colleagues, and they'd switch every few hours or so. But when they arrived in this town, they were shocked to find that the SS were nowhere in sight. This is toward the end of the war. The Russians were coming in from the east. The Americans were coming in from the west, and there was no Germans in sight. And for a few days, my father felt a little free, and they were able to get some food, and they thought they had it beat. But the German soldiers came back a few days later. They were escaping the Russians, and they were forced to walk to a railroad for a few days, and then he died during that walk. And the railroad had the cattle cars that would take them to Buchenwald. Buchenwald was kind of an international concentration camp. There were prisoners from all over the world, and some of them were Ukrainian soldiers. And my father and other Jews were brutalized by the Ukrainians. They stole that. The Jews were issued, prisoners were issued ration cards for food, and the Ukrainians came at night and stole them. And if you resisted, they would strangle you. So it was pretty terrible, both from their fellow prisoners were brutalizing them as well as the Germans were. But they only spent a few days there. Eventually went by cattle car again to Gross Rosen. And then a few days later, his final destination in the war was Dachau, Allach. The American 7th Army Division came and rescued him and my mother, who happened to be in that camp as well. And they bombed German forces, and eventually they overcame them, and my father was free. My father's first view of an American, he couldn't believe how big they were. My father was very small. He was 5'3", 5'4". He couldn't. They were giants, and he was very impressed by the black soldiers that he saw. It was the first time he'd ever seen a black person, and he thought these were gods from heaven. The American Red Cross was there. He got the food for the first time in 5 years, but he was basically left on his own to wander around. And he and his friends, a couple of friends, went to a town called Stalchek, where they lived for about a month or two. And they found the food. They broke into a butcher shop that had lots of food to eat. My father said he ate all day and he got sick. Actually, some Jews died overeating after years of starvation. And eventually the UN relief agency came. The UN had just been established a few months earlier. And they took him and his friends to Feldafing, which was a displaced person camp, where he worked as a locksmith.
Really?
He
was so pessimistic.
And that's where he met my mother.
And then what happened?
He learned that there were no survivors from his family. When he left the Warsaw Ghetto to go to this farm, it was the last time he got to see his family. And my parents married a few months later, and my brother David was born in Feldafing. And my father was, my parents were trying to figure out where to go. There was a great book written by a historian, David Nassau, called The Last Billion, which describes the plight of people in displaced persons camps. David Nassau is a friend of mine, and when I found out he was writing a book, I introduced him to my father, and my father told him much of the story that I'm telling you now. My father wanted to go to Israel, which had not yet been established, but certainly there was a Zionist movement afoot, and many Jews were going there. My mother wanted to come to the U.S. because she found out that an uncle who had left Poland in the 20s was living in Brooklyn with his family. And they found out about my mother. They had never met her, obviously. And they arranged for them to come to the U.S. They would sponsor them if they came to the U.S. So my parents boarded a boat and came to the U.S. in late 47. And their first view of the United States was the magnificent New York harbor. They went to Brooklyn. My father found work within a week. He ended up having his own upholstery business. He ended up seeing his 3 sons graduate from college and professional school and make successes of their lives. He lived long enough to see his young adult grandchildren prosper. He loved them beyond comprehension. My father didn't hide his emotions. There was no nuance. It was just raw, plain love and emotion. And in 2 weeks, it'll be the anniversary of his death from COVID. There's a lot more to tell, believe me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lachman. In your dad's own words, some of the greatest, the happiest days of his life when David and you and Charles were born, his 3 sons. And you told us about the time of his life between about 18 and 25. And well, now we're going to call upon David and Charles to share just a few words about the kind of man that your dad was able to be, even after having experienced what none of us could ever really imagine. And so we first call upon David, who is the oldest, and we'll hear from him.
He was a truly remarkable man. He left a great legacy in the values he instilled on his sons and grandchildren. He was mentally tough, strong-willed, and determined. As a Jew in Poland, he had to be mentally strong to deal with humiliating discrimination and the miserable living conditions that he and his family had to endure. He survived the pain and suffering during his time in the Warsaw Ghetto and in the various concentration camps to which he was sent. His entire family was slaughtered or died of malnutrition or disease, yet he persevered. How does a human being deal with all this acute physical and mental anguish and still manage to conduct his life, smiling his way through life? One thing that always stood out for me as far as our dad is concerned was his work ethic, which was totally off the charts. He comes to this country, doesn't speak a word of English. At the age of 25, he came here, and he found a job as an upholsterer within 3 days of arriving in the United States. And he worked like a dog. He worked 6 days a week, 9 to 10 hours a day. And that work ethic enabled him to buy a home 3 years after his arrival in America. A few years later, he managed to buy the upholstery business from his boss. To me, me and my brothers, he literally embodied the American dream of starting with virtually nothing, working relentlessly and tirelessly, and eventually owning and building a successful business. What a fantastic role model for his sons and grandchildren. My brothers and I always knew that his first priority was his family, to provide a good life and a comfortable standard of living for us. No one could ever doubt his love and devotion to our mom. Yes, at times he could be a bit impatient, but theirs was a beautiful love story. Each time my wife and I visited him at Brandywine, our dad would inevitably reach out, hold her hand for an extended period of time, and tell us how much he loved her. Finally, our dad was a devoted Jew and Zionist. After he retired, he would without fail attend services on the Jewish holidays, as well as weekly and Saturday services. Through his actions, he proved that evil never ultimately prevails. We are forever grateful for his teachings through the beautiful way he conducted his life.
Thank you, David. And now for the youngest of the family, we call upon Charles.
He lived a life of quiet dignity. His focus was on business and earning money to keep his family going. And although they did participate in Holocaust memorial events every year, absolutely, they never really sought the limelight. But it's interesting to note that in his final years, his optimism and his love of life and his love of his wife and his family, even after all he went through, that defined who he was. And it's really quite moving, and we're forever grateful for the author for really memorializing our dad's life in such a wonderful book as The Last Million, which tells the story the DP camps. And I just wanted to also relay that our dad's life story, he actually wrote about many, many years ago. I guess and he gave it to us, and it's a beautiful document. And it details his war experiences, and it ends this way. And I think this is, I can't think of anything more moving than to say what I have to say in my father's words, which I'll read to you. That I came out alive from this inferno and write about it is a miracle in itself. I still have nightmares where I see myself being selected to the gas chamber. I live, but the pain and the suffering I endured is still with me. So that's our dad. And through all that, he still lived a life of love and honor and devotion to his family. And I also want to thank everyone at the temple in his later years when he was living on Little Neck Parkway. I would come visit them every Friday night pretty much, and come sundown, he would be responsible for closing the shul. He was so proud of the big set of keys that he carried, and he loved the synagogue. He loved all the people there. He loved the rabbi, and it really gave him a great deal of pleasure to be such an active participant in the daily life of Temple Torah. So for that, we really, really thank you for everything that you did to make that happen.
Just as we went through Irving's story from the dark days to the beautiful days, God bless him, he lived to be 99 years old. And we hope and pray that his memory will forever be a blessing. And we want to thank his children, excuse me, his children, David, Herb, and Charles, for sharing with us, being with us today in this virtual way in which we are meeting these days. There have been a number of activities that have brought Yom HaShoah to the forefront on the minds of the members of our community. We have been participating in the worldwide Daffodil Project, and I hope that as you ride around town, that you'll notice the daffodils that were replanted at our synagogue and at Lakeville Park, and the ones that grew up from last year at the Little Neck Triangle. And there are a few still, I think we need to replant as well at Marathon Jewish Center and at Temple Torah. But these daffodils are our statement to bring beauty and air into this world when we think of the 1.5 million children who were murdered in the Holocaust. When these flowers come up, this is in their memory. And the Daffodil Project, this year, instead of, we've been donating to the Blue Card, but this year, we invited everyone to participate in the virtual Daffodil Dash. And if you're a runner or a walker, you can run 5K or 10K. Or if you just walk and bike, you can write down the miles and send it in. And there's a little competition. But beyond that, there is a Queens Synagogue team. And if you register and you say that you're part of the team and you send whatever donation you can, that money goes to help needy Holocaust survivors. It goes to help with the education of the community about the Holocaust. Some very, very important organizations You can either click on the link that was in the program and that's been online and so on. But if you'd like to send a donation to your synagogue, either whatever synagogue is yours, we'll take care of it and make sure that as a community, we will take the memory of those that we remember today and let their memory be indeed a blessing to help others who are indeed in need. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Yom HaShoah committee. Usually we have a program, and if I can find it to share it with you, I'm going to share with you the, let's see, do I have it? No, I don't. Oh, it's not on my screen. Okay, then I won't share it with you. But we have a whole list of thanks to the co-chairs of this committee. That is Ellen Charlotte and George Klein and Shirley Silverstein. And to all the members of the committee, I'm not going to say all the names because I might miss one and I don't have the program in front of me, or Ellen might be able to do that in a moment. And we want to thank all of those who helped to replant the daffodils this year. And the final thing that I'd like to say as my wrap-up remarks is that we come together as a community. We're fortunate to hear from survivors and children of survivors, to give us a connection and to enable us to come together. Probably 120 or 130 people are here today. And we bring 4 synagogues together. And this year we're grateful to be including the Hollis Hills Bayside Jewish Center, together with our congregation, Congregation Lador Vador, Oakland Little Neck Jewish Center, Temple Torah, and the Marathon Jewish Center. This is what makes us a community. But my feeling is that Yom HaShoah, at least part of it, just like every other part of Judaism, belongs in our homes. And that's why we've had for nearly 5 years now a candle project where we send out biographies of individuals so that we don't just light a candle for the 6 million, but we light candles for individual people. We take some time to read about their lives and to say a prayer and to light a candle and to put it in our window. And just as the story of the Exodus from Egypt is part of our daily experience, I think that in our time, the reality of the Holocaust that was unlike anything that ever happened, and if we have anything to say about it, it will never happen again, must be a part of our lives on a real personal basis. So I want to thank all of you who are here, who I can't see, who I wish I could see, for coming, for listening, and for taking some time out of a beautiful day to hear stories and to contemplate and to think, how is it that we can rise up from the ashes of the Holocaust? Because this day is really known as Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day of devastation and the day of heroism. And so today we celebrate those who survived, and not only survived, but thrived, just like Irving did, have children and grandchildren, and to live a beautiful, beautiful life with smiles. That is who we are as a people. And that is what this day is all about. And that's why we always conclude our program with the song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, because historically, Israel was born 3 years after the Holocaust. And in many ways, it is our answer. It is the Jewish answer to say we are in charge of our own lives, in charge of our own destiny, and we are indeed able to be a free people in our own land, and that is a reason for celebration. Indeed, Yom HaShoah, which was last Thursday, is 8 days before Yom HaAtzmaut. So we always go from the darkness of this day to the brightness of the Israel's independence. So, Ellen, if you have the program in front of you, and you would like to mention the names of all those who are on the committee, as well as those who helped plant the daffodils, that would be great.
Okay.
And anything else you'd like to say? Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Rabbi Yaffe. We want to thank the entire committee for helping in this effort. Ted Goodman, Rabbi Gary Green, Rabbi Eli Shifrin, Cheryl Feiner, Rabbi Gordon Yaffe, Edith Schwartz, Eva Kessner, and Neil Garfinkel. Special thanks to the vocalists, to Dr. Ken Kahaner, who sang the Star Spangled Banner, Irina Starr, who sang the Hatikva, and Sally Coons, who sang Anima Amin. Thank you to all the synagogue clergy, Rabbi Eli Shifrin for hosting from Temple Torah, Rabbi Yaffe and Cantor Joshua Schroen from Congregational Ador Vador, and Rabbi David Weisen Cantor Saul Zim from Hollis Bayside Jewish Center, and Rabbi Gary Green from Marathon. Special thanks finally to the daffodil planters, Ricky Block, Elaine Fleischman, Renee Gottesman, Debbie Sossman, Lisa Tamari, Shachar Tamari, Jessica Tamari, and Rabbi Gordon Yaffe. Thank you very much. We couldn't do it without community, takes a village, and thank you all for being here today on this important occasion.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Cantor Schroen and his family, the Yerushalayim Shel Zahav.
Ani Gidor Yerushalayim shel zahav, v'shel nechoshet v'shel or, halo lechol shirayim ani gimor. Yerushalayim